Alrighty, y'all, we'll go on ahead and get started here in just a couple seconds. Appreciate everybody for being here. Well, greetings, everyone. My name is Miles Pendleton. I serve as president for the local Eugene Springfield branch of the NAACP. It's a great joy to welcome you to this week's iteration of a City Club program. Specifically, we're here to talk about civil rights at this current moment as well as civil rights moving forward. In that regard, I would like to welcome today's speakers. In addition to myself serving as the moderator today, we're really eager to bring forward a panel of just tremendous leaders in their respective fields. They bring forward a great degree of expertise and insights, and so just really want to thank all of our additional speakers who will be here today. In introducing them, we have David Frank, who serves as professor of rhetoric at the University of Oregon. And then, as you may know, we had also additionally invited Corvallis City Councilor Bria Lewis to attend, but unfortunately there was unexpected scheduling conflict, and so they will not be able to join us. Still all the same, she sends her regards, she sends her solidarity, and she does wish she was here, but unfortunately we will continue forward and have the two of us here as today's speakers. In that sense, for almost 30 years, the City Club of Eugene has remained committed to its mission to build community vision through open inquiry by providing weekly programs that offer the opportunity for community members to learn together, discuss important ideas, and consider differing viewpoints. Through their participation, City Club members and speakers model respectful and curious civic engagement, which we hope informs and empowers our community to better engage and better collaborate with one another. We believe now more than ever that this open exchange of ideas and information is critical to not only the future but the health of this community and as well as all other communities. In that sense, we invite you to join us every week to hear directly from different leaders, different organizations, different community members who are taking part in this work of building community and trying to lead our local Eugene area as well as Oregon more broadly into its future generations, so on and so forth. Of course, naturally, we cannot do this work without the generosity of various different volunteers, various different staff members, and also especially our sponsors as well. Accordingly, we would like to thank said sponsors for their generosity and everything that they provide in supporting the vision and the facilitation of these different programs, and we'll do so here now. In that regard, we would like to thank the Eugene Area Chamber of Commerce for serving as a catalytic leader in creating a vibrant and diverse economy that drives economic opportunity and well-being. We would like to thank Kaiser Permanente, who exists to provide high-quality, affordable healthcare services and to improve the health of our members and the communities we serve. More information of them is on their website. We would equally like to thank the University of Oregon, who has helped Oregonians question critically, think logically, reason effectively, and also communicate clearly and creatively while living ethically since 1876. We would like to also thank Peace Health, who has been proud to serve the Eugene and Lane County communities, as well as communities beyond our local areas, and as our hometown healthcare partner for over 80 years. The Peace Health mission is to keep you and your family healthy, and again, we encourage folks to go to their website to learn more information. We would equally like to thank Lane Community College for transforming lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success. And last but not least, we would like to thank all of our City Club members, all of the people who pour into this work once again. It truly is a process that many hands hold, effort that many hands pour into, and so we're just so ever thankful for everybody who contributes towards the realization of events such as these. And so whether you join us here today for the first time today or a long-time listener, if you value these sorts of community conversations and the way we approach said community conversations, we invite you to support this by becoming a member at cityclubofeugene.org. And of course, City Club isn't just about conversation, it's about taking conversation and translating it into action. It is our hope that with informed understanding, you'll engage in the issues impacting our community. And now, we would like to introduce today's program. On August 28, 1963, 250,000 Americans lined the National Mall for a march on Washington for jobs and freedoms. While the event is now remembered for Martin Luther King Jr.'s iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, the initial news reports about the march did not dwell on those seminal words. Instead, as the New York Times headline declared, the march was a quote-unquote polite but pressing insistence on civil rights now, and described it as nothing short of the greatest assembly for redress of grievances that this capital has ever seen. 60 years later, the march is seen as one of the greatest triumphs of American history, not just for Dr. King's rhetorical brilliance, but for its key role in pressuring Congress and the White House to enact civil rights legislation, most notably which took form in the 1964 and the 1965 civil rights legislation, as well as the Voting Rights Act. Today's program is a departure from our regular format, as we're starting the conversation with something special and different. Today's program will begin with a viewing of our own University of Oregon graduate James Blue's award-winning documentary about the March on Washington. Then we'll be joined by speaker David Frank, a professor of rhetoric at the University of Oregon, to take part in our conversation, which will also include an opportunity for question and answers. Please join me in turning to James Blue's 1963 documentary, The March, the Cold War, Civil Rights, and the Problem of American Apartheid.
Want me to give a brief introduction?
Oh, after the video.
After
the video.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Carl T. Rowan. As the new director of the United States Information Agency, I have the privilege to present to you a dramatic document of man's continuing search for dignity. It is a film about the great Civil Rights March in Washington, a moving exercise of one of the most cherished rights in a free society, the right of peaceful protest. I believe that this demonstration of both whites and Negroes, supported by the federal government and by both President Johnson and the late President Kennedy, is a profound example of the procedures unfettered men use to broaden the horizons of freedom and deepen the meaning of personal liberty.
Freedom Now movement, hear me. We are requesting all citizens to move into Washington, to go by plane, by car, bus, any way that you can get there. Walk if necessary. We are pushing for jobs, housing, desegregated schools. This is an urgent request. Please join. Go to Washington.
Negroes want the same things that white citizens possess. All of their rights. They want no reservations. They want complete equality, social, economic, and political. And no force under the sun can stem and block and stop this civil rights revolution which is now underway.
On August 28, 1963, 200,000 Americans came to Washington to demand complete freedom for everyone. This is the story of that day.
Your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on.
Well, if the FBI would investigate,
Yeah.
then probably then we could integrate.
Yeah. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on.
Well, we are all here, black and white,
Yeah.
trying to fight for equal rights.
Yeah.
Keep
Your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on.
They came from Los Angeles and San Francisco, or about the distance from Moscow to Bombay. They came from Cleveland, from Chicago, or about the distance from Buenos Aires to Rio de Janeiro. They came from Jackson, Mississippi, from Birmingham, Alabama, or about the distance from Johannesburg to Dar es Salaam. By the end of August 1963, in some places of the United States, a Negro could not go to school where he chose, eat where he wished, build his home where it pleased him, or find jobs for which he was qualified. He had been insulted, beaten, jailed, drenched with water, chased by dogs. But he was coming to Washington, he said, to swallow up hatred and love, to overcome violence by peaceful protest. Many people predicted violence. Negro groups trained themselves to overwhelm it. Armed with portable two-way radios, volunteers scattered throughout the march would keep watch. Should violence come then that day, they would call for help. Each man would have a code name. Freedom, equality, justice, jobs.
This is Freedom 2 to Equality 1. This is Freedom 2 to Equality 1.
The Constitution of the United States guarantees every American the right to protest peaceably. 200,000 Americans then were going to use this right. 350 years ago, the white man came to America, and 350 years ago, the Negro came to America. The one came as master, the other as slave. 100 years ago, Abraham Lincoln declared as President of the United States that all slaves would henceforward be set free. Now, both black and white Americans were preparing to march to say that a century later, the black man still was not completely free. If I am not free, you are not free. If one man on earth is partly enslaved, the world is not completely free. It was every man's duty then to help every other man.
We need 4 people at table 8.
In New York, volunteers worked for 2 days and 2 nights to make lunches for the march. They made 80,000 cheese sandwiches.
We shall overcome.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
Okay, thank you. Get your buttons here from Martha Washington. Get your buttons here from Martha Washington. Do you have it?
The pen said, I march for jobs and freedom. Everyone who marched wore one. The 200,000 people who were to march that day were held together by the strength of that pen.
This morning, Father, we ask if thou would hear the prayers of thy children everywhere. Those who are burdened down because of conditions here in America, and those who are confused about how they should treat their fellow man. Oh God, we ask for those who have hatred in their heart to touch their hearts right now, oh Father, and somehow fill their hearts with love. And oh God, make this land in which we live be a land of plenty and a land of righteousness. Oh God, may we recognize this land a land of freedom for every race. Oh Father.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Testing. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This is an audio test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In the night, few people had arrived. Negro leaders feared that their work had failed. Those who did come waited singing.
We are encouraged. We're not going to fight our white brethren with malice, nor are we going to fight them with any falsified stories, nor are we going to fight them with hatred, but we're going to fight them with love. When they hate us, we're going to absorb their hatred in love. When they speak against us, we're going to speak things of love toward them. We're not going to let their hatred turn us around, but we're going to love them on every side.
Oh, I do believe. Oh, we shall overcome someday.
Shake hands with the person beside you.
Reverend, what about that trademark? Do you want to be free? Yeah! Do you want to be free? Yeah! Do you want to be free? Yeah! Let me hear you say it.
We're almost there.
All right, just pass them back. All right, I'll start on this side. All right, pass them down. You have any questions
Wake up, girl.
or anything that's bothering you, be sure you contact your captains for anything, and they will take it from there. Do not try to do anything on your own, because the minute you do, you will be upsetting the purpose of this march. The whole thing is an orderly, conducted march.
Oh, there's Mary. There's Mary.
we call this section of our program to a halt and ask you to assemble in your respective groups and begin the march for freedom now. Let us begin quietly and orderly to move out, remembering that by your great numbers you have forced a slow, dignified, and stately march. We'll see you at the Lincoln Memorial.
We see you on here. Very, very fine. We're going to wake up Lincoln. Tell him to get up and stop patting his feet. Very self-satisfied.
I would first like to congratulate all of you on the orderly, dignified manner in which you executed the march from the Washington Memorial. You have already told the world what we are here for and shown them by your courage, determination, and your order that we mean business.
We will now be favored with a solo, Miss Marian Anderson.
We would like to do for you a Negro spiritual, which has been the favorite of many audiences through the United States. At the piano is Mr. Fax. We would like to do for you, he's got the whole world in his hands.
He's got the whole In his hands he's got the big round world. In his hands he's got the wide world. In his hands he's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the wind and the rain. In his hands he's got the moon and the stars. In his hands he's got the wind and the rain. In his hands he's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the little bits of baby. In his hands he's got the little bits of baby. In his hands he's got the little bits of baby. In his hands he's got the whole world in his hands. He's got you and me, brother. In his hands he's got you and me, sister. In his hands he's got you and me, brother. In his hands he's got the whole world in his hands. Oh, he's got everybody. In his hands he's got everybody. In his hands he's got everybody here. Right in his hands, he's got the whole world in his
I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the herbaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last."
I think history was written today which will have its effect on coming generations with respect to our democracy, with respect to our ideals, with respect to the great struggle of man toward freedom and human dignity.
There were many who praised this day and said that there had been a new awakening in the conscience of the nation. Others called it a national disgrace. In the wake of this day, more violence was to come, more hatred. But in the long history of man's cruelty to man, this was a day of hope.
Wow, can we do another round of applause for that? That was amazing. Awesome, awesome. So once again, I just want to thank everybody for joining us for this special City Club of Eugene viewing of the University of Oregon graduate James Blue's award-winning documentary about the March on Washington. We're thrilled to welcome today's speaker, Professor David Frank, up to the stage here now. We'll start going through our more kind of panel-oriented discussion before ultimately pivoting towards a Q&A. So we'd love to welcome our speaker to the floor.
In my 5 minutes, what I want to do is to share with you the joy that I have in bringing this movie to you. I have been invited by the National Archives to present this movie at the National Archives the night before the 60th anniversary commemoration that will take place this August, on August the 26th. And so this movie, produced by a University of Oregon graduate, is something that the University of Oregon can be proud of. I think that James Blue, who graduated from Jefferson High School in Portland, who came down to the University of Oregon in the early 50s, majored in speech and theater, put his art into service of social justice with this film. This film won 4 major international awards, and in 2008 was introduced into the National Registry, a very high honor. Now, James Blue learned how to think about the world as a result of his University of Oregon graduate education. He lived on Charlton Street in the Campbell House. He spent a great deal of time, as Sherry and others have done, in Villard Hall. And he is a person that was really affected by his University of Oregon graduation. I'm delighted to see Evan, your City Club intern, who was with me at Oxford. I'm on the faculty of a human rights organization that organizes events for undergraduates like Evan at Oxford. I was talking with Camilla about the fact that we share despair about the future. And my hope is that we can see in James Blue and in Evan and in Miles, who will be at Harvard University Law School sometime soon, we can see in them and their education the promise for rectifying the future. So I want to say 4 things about the movie itself. First, that the event of bringing 240,000 people to Washington, D.C. in August of 1963 was a radical event. And in the wake of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, the FBI declared that he was the most dangerous Negro in America. Not Malcolm X, not the Nation of Islam, but Martin Luther King Jr. because of his advocacy for nonviolence, a nonviolent, multiracial social movement pressing the country to be true to its promise of equality. And so it was a radical event. You saw A. Philip Randolph twice in this film. You may not remember him, but he is one of the heroes of the 20th century. In 1919, he was declared by Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General as the most dangerous Negro in America, again because he advocated nonviolence. And the administrations back in that time period understood that nonviolence was a much more powerful vehicle of achieving social justice than violence. A second part, or another element of this movie that you can see, is that it featured nonviolence, and that the argument that the movement made was that it ought to be targeting whites and blacks to use nonviolence and legislation to solve problems rather than despair and violence. And that theme, I think, comes through very clearly. The movie puts into service art in service to social justice. So you can see that James Blue carefully arranged every frame, every image. Now you can see that he turned the camera on the people rather than on the 7 or 8 major speakers that took place, that spoke at that event. And you can see as well that when Martin Luther King Jr. was speaking, there were 2 or 3 close-up shots, and James Blue was behind the camera shooting Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. But that he also made use of a wide frame to nest King in the larger demonstration of 240,000 citizens, 200,000 African Americans and 40,000 whites. But the final implication that I'd like to share with you is that this march made a big difference. So you could see it, this movie, and maybe King's speech as a Hallmark card, but it wasn't. If you listen carefully to James Blue's narration at the beginning, it is essentially a 1619 project because he acknowledges that African Americans, blacks were brought here against their will and placed into slavery. 80% of King's speech is a condemnation of American apartheid. And the speech, which is quite famous, has been taken out of context and as a kind of dream rather than it being, again, nested in the nightmare of American apartheid. In the wake of the March on Washington, the Congress and the President were forced to do something about the state of African Americans. So the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed in part as a result of the March on Washington. The 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed as a result of the March on Washington and the Civil Rights Movement. Lyndon Johnson launched the Great Society program, which hosted 200 different legislative acts to rectify the problem of American apartheid. Among those acts was the War on Poverty, and there's significant research that at least between 1964 and the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, this country was making significant progress toward rectifying the problem of racial segregation and America's mistreatment of blacks. Upon the election of Ronald Reagan, many of those advances were reversed, and it continues to be a problem that many people in this country still do not embrace the vision that Martin Luther King Jr. presented. And so, Miles, I'm delighted that we will now have a panel conversation about civil rights, maybe in Eugene, Oregon, and we can be proud that this film was a product of a student that went to Jefferson High School in Portland, went to the University of Oregon, majored in speech and in theater, then went on and was selected to produce and to write this film. So thank you very much. Are we the panel? Yep. think you heard me because you were talking to a colleague, but I declared that you were going to go to Harvard Law School. So I just want you to get ready for that.
Awesome, awesome. Well, funny story, actually. I serve as a legislative aide for Senator Manning as well, and so on the floor of the Senate, he already proclaimed that I was a Harvard admit, so he's put it on record that that's the case. So.
He's paid for it too?
No, but he's committed me to it a little bit early, but still all the while. Just so appreciated your remarks there, and I'm just taking a second here to reflect on the video. It was personally my first time being able to have an opportunity to watch that video, and so with that, obviously, naturally, I'd seen Dr. King's remarks. I'd seen the remarks of John Lewis. I think a couple of us probably saw John Lewis in the background there of a couple different scenes. Randolph, as you mentioned. But, you know, in your remarks, you kind of talked about the circumstances of the march, what initiated kind of the spirit of it, what drew them to deciding that now was the moment to take part in such an activity, such a demonstration. What similarities do you see to that moment which inspired that march to where we find ourselves now? Do you find us in a similar circumstance societally, or what would you say to that?
I would say we can learn from the March on Washington as a result of James Blue's film. He pays particular attention to the organizational details that were required to bring 240,000 people to Washington, D.C. At the National Council of Churches hosted the creation of 80,000 sack lunches with 80,000 cheese sandwiches. Unfortunately, there was significant misogyny among the leadership of the civil rights movement, and women were delegated to making sandwiches and making the signs, but they were the glue to the civil rights movement. But for women in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. would not have had a platform or a place to speak. And so I'm hopeful that we will draw from the fact that the March on Washington, even though there were some flaws in it, tried to create a sense of community by meeting people face to face. One of the problems with modern day social movements is that they rely on tweets, they rely on iMessages, they rely on technology. And it was very clear that the civil rights movement did rely upon face-to-face communication, food, and did you hear the wonderful music that laced through the entire film? There are 6 freedom songs that recur in this film that James Blue carefully selected and culled from the march. And so the role that music plays in face-to-face communication and very careful attention to detail. Bayard Rustin is to the right of Martin Luther King Jr. He is another hero of the 20th century because he was in charge of putting the march together. He was gay, and Strom Thurmond, in August of 1963, before the march took place, went to the Senate floor and decried the fact that Bayard Rustin was gay, he was a communist, etc. And to Dr. King's credit, he kept Bayard Rustin in charge. And Bayard Rustin did a marvelous, miraculous job keeping that march together. So we can learn about the need to provide people who are in social movements with cheese sandwiches, that they need to have someone who will pay attention to the details, and that we need to be in community face-to-face rather than separated by digital technology.
Yeah, and I so appreciate that theme of community, of solidarity, of building a coalition that includes folks who have historically been a part of these conversations, as well as finding a way to uplift and encourage the voices of those who haven't previously been a part, certain circumstances have been intentionally excluded. And I think that's something where, as we talk about where we find ourselves now and where do we move forward as community in the name of civil rights and the pursuit of it, I think it's that idea of solidarity, of community, and just thinking of what does a collectivist movement, what does a coalition-based movement truly look like. And I think when we see oftentimes these examples, such as the March on Washington, such as the Selma March, so on and so forth, we see a lot of highlights of the successes, the commonality, folks joining hand in hand, doing the singing, so on and so forth. And I don't necessarily know if we appreciate the effort, the initiative, and at times the difficulty with which it took to create such an outcome. I think we oftentimes think of coalitions in their positive sense, right? You see commonality, you see community, you see people sharing hands, walking and marching together, but you don't see the conversations that take place behind closed doors. You don't see the work that takes place in figuring out where do the different community members exist. You don't see the difficulty or the difficult conversations that take place in galvanizing folks behind a shared idea. How do we even create a shared idea, a shared message, and come to a place where we can committedly buy into that collectively? And I think, unfortunately, what we find ourselves now is at a point of greater awareness. We see an unfortunate practice of when there is disagreement, the immediate sort of inclination or the immediate thing that we jump to is division. Is saying, well, that person over there, that group or that organization or that coalition, they don't see things the same way. We shouldn't work with them because they're not truly, equity champions. That group over there, they don't know what they're talking about. Let's do it with the folks who agree with us. And I think that does such a disservice to us, because that civil rights movement that we talk about, while we see Dr. King and while we see, the accolades, we just took as a branch a trip down south where we did a civil rights mission trip, and we stopped by the Birminghams of the world, we stopped by the Selmas of the world, we stopped by all these different locations and spoke with some of the civil rights leaders as well as their children. And they would tell us there was a lot of people who did not like Dr. King. There were a lot of people who said, who do you think you are from Atlanta coming into this city and telling us how we're going to run our movement? I mean, you talk about Shuttlesworth, you talk about all these different folks who had different ideas, and the civil rights movement, truth be told, was very city to city. But we don't see that tire, we don't see that turmoil, we don't see that constructive process of figuring out how do we take disagreement and form coalition from it. And so as we start to think about that, and as we think about the successes that we witnessed within that march, you reference in your remarks what ultimately came about from that. At this stage where we are now, what opportunity do you continue to see for us to galvanize and pursue? Like, what would those outcomes potentially be?
Evan, over there, that outcome, when he graduates from the University of Oregon with a degree in political science, summa cum laude, he will go on to Harvard Law School and be in your wake after you evolve and become a major politician passing legislation. We need policy and legislation. The good feelings on this film, that's wonderful. But the goal would be federal legislation that offers people who've been disadvantaged opportunities to move forward. James Blue, the young man from Portland, was raised by a mother who was a member of the Portland John Birch Society. And so this is a man, the filmmaker, who was able to overcome that legacy. The mother worked at Vanport and was, again, a racist. And so James Blue came to the University of Oregon, and I don't know if the University of Oregon was the reason that he was able to shed his racism, but there was something about the cauldron of diversity, even back in the 1950s at the University of Oregon, that did promote some diversity. He went to school in France, and then he really understood the problem of America's apartheid. I also think that when we teach Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, we should not call it the dream. The speech is really about the nightmare and the possibility of a dream. Because as you listen to his speech, 80% of it is about the condemnation of racism in specific terms in Mississippi. And so we need, I think, to reframe the way that we see the March on Washington and reframe the way that we even see King, because he was truly a radical. And Mike, and my hope is that through education, people like you and Evan and other students can move forward to take the mantle that King really established. I also think that nonviolent social movements in which thousands and thousands of people press the legislature in Salem. Portland is the whitest city in the country. Why? Why? Because our Constitution back in the 1850s outlawed the entrance of blacks. And so when I taught at the University of Oregon, which I did for 43 years, most of my classes were full of very lovely young women and men who were white. And that was that deprived my students, the fact that there were more African American students, of their access to how different people perceive the world. And it's a real tragedy that even now the University of Oregon only has, I think, 1.5% of its total student population is African American, which makes the affirmative action case, well, we can go in that direction.
Yeah, I think that's a program even of itself, isn't it? But no, I so appreciate the premise you presented there, and the terminology I've heard used previously is an audacity of hope. An ability to have enough audacity to look at your immediate surroundings, to look at history, not see something present in that context, and still believe it's possible. And I think that, as you summarize and as you articulate, Dr. King's speech, not as being a speech about hope, but the possibility of hope, I think that's so powerful. And it's something for all of us in this moment where after we come out of COVID, after we come out of, a George Floyd moment, which begetted a broader social awakening, after we've passed a couple of years by, and now we're starting to see some of the initiatives, some of the work, some of the funding, some of the frameworks that were developed in the aftermath of 2020 start to whittle down, start to change, start to kind of disappear in many sense. You look at a number of these Fortune 500 companies, and the DEI officers that they were hiring, a large number of which are black women, are now being let go of, are now being fired. In the midst of all this recession, in the midst of all these layoffs, their stories aren't being told, they're not being captured, and we're not giving enough attention towards that. And so as we, ask one more question, and then we'll pivot to a broader Q&A session with our guests here as well. What do you think is the key, or if we look to history, to the March on Washington, the Civil Rights Movement more broadly, what have you found is the key to continued hope, continued promise?
We need to keep in our brains the two impulses that are seen in American history. One is deeply racist, and the other is deeply anti-racist. So when you listen to King, you can feel optimistic, but you also, I believe, need to hear the voices of Stokely Carmichael, who critiqued King and said, America does not have a conscience. And his evidence was clear because in the South, blacks were lynched, and in the North, blacks were redlined, and that continues on today. And so there is, on one hand, as you have suggested, there's some racial progress, and at the same time, there's racial regress. And so our responsibility is to see both, to be clear-eyed about the nightmare of racism in America, as well as the possibility of its rectification through federal policy. And that is why, as we approach the anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, we should really do our archival research to see how it has truly remarkably affected this country. It made America, the 64 Act, for the first time, a truly multiracial democracy. And the Civil Rights Act, Sections 2 and Sections 5, have also guaranteed, to a degree, the rights of African Americans and other minorities, the right to vote. And those two acts, and as well as the Great Society program, did great work. But for every move forward, there's a backlash. And what King was trying to articulate was a way of dealing with that white backlash through the vehicle of love and nonviolent action and aggressive efforts to make sure that state and national legislatures would pass legislation, policy actions to rectify the problems of race in America.
Thank you. Amazing. So as we pivot towards a broader Q&A where we incorporate our audience, we wanted to take a brief moment just to thank a couple more of our sponsors. Accordingly, we'd like to thank our gold sponsors, Network Charter School, Homes for Good, Hirschner Huntner LLC, Evans, Elder, Brown, and Subert. And then we would also like to thank our in-kind sponsors, KRVM 91.9 Radio, PAC INFO and Simplified Computing LLC, Dotson's Photography, Ninkasi Better Living Room, and Claim 52. Accordingly, now we'll enter our period of Q&A with the audience. Oh, we'll take a 5-minute break actually before we transition into it. Thank you. Alrighty, awesome. So we'll regroup here in just a couple of seconds. But as mentioned before we took a quick break, we encourage folks to come up here and ask questions if they have questions. I believe the microphone to ask questions is just right over here, and then folks can feel free to line up, as in order of who arrives first up there at the microphone, so that we can move through the different Q&As. So thank you.
I'm Dave Fidanki, City Club member. Professor Frank, you talked a little bit about the I Have a Dream speech being much more than that. And I remember having a conversation with the late Dr. Ed Coleman about that speech. He referred to it as the promissory note speech because Dr. King went through the post-Civil War amendments to the Constitution that guaranteed the right to vote for freed slaves, and of course the Equal Protection Clause, and talked about how that note had been returned to the freed slaves marked insufficient funds as a bounced check, but that the note was still owed by the federal government to African Americans and to all Americans, really. And you also mentioned John Lewis's speech, and that he spoke. Lewis was the head of SNCC at the time, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and of course went on to be a member of Congress and help write laws, and up until his death, he was still trying to repair the damage that the U.S. Supreme Court did to the Voting Rights Act that he had worked so hard to help pass. So I'd like to hear your thoughts and Miles' thoughts on that concept of the promissory note that is still owed to this country. Thanks.
Great question, David. When we teach this speech to our children and grandchildren, we should emphasize the fact that it is about the promissory note and really less so about the dream, because King wanted the American public back in 1963 to understand the horror of American apartheid. The organizers of the March on Washington chose August 28th because it was the anniversary of the murder of Emmett Till. And that took place on August 28, 1955. And Emmett Till's body, he was 13, 14 years old, was found at the bottom of the Tallahassee River, and he was murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan. And the mother of Emmett Till insisted that the bloated body of Emmett Till be displayed to the American public. And so A. Philip Randolph and other civil rights leaders chose August 28th as a date to commemorate the murder of Emmett Till. The theme that threads the March on Washington together is twofold. One is to make sure that people understood the nightmare of American apartheid, because segregation was real. James Blue finished his film on November 22nd, 1963. The day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And he was editing the film after the Birmingham church was bombed on September 15th, 1963. And so the movie itself, as he says, Blue says at the end, is only about a day. It's only about a day. And some of the folks that went back on buses to Mississippi after the March on Washington were stoned. And so you can imagine this young man, James Blue, editing the film on November 22nd with the assassination of Kennedy, and then knowing that the Birmingham church had been blown up, and knowing that the buses that returned to Mississippi had been stoned. How was he supposed to frame this particular movie? And I think he did it brilliantly by saying a day. And so King's speech lays out the problem, as David mentioned, that America has a promissory note that it has not paid to its African American citizens. And the solution, he argued, was nonviolence and federal legislative policy outlawing segregation and better guaranteeing African Americans and others equal rights to the ballot. And so I'm really glad you asked that question, because the King's speech should be the blueprint, in my judgment, of how we move forward, being very conscious of the problem of race and offering a solution in the form of nonviolent social movements in which people come together in community and eat cheese sandwiches and laugh and sing together, but for a serious purpose, which is to force Salem and Washington, D.C. to pass legislation strengthening, not eviscerating, the Voting Rights Act, strengthening the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and celebrating the work of Justice Jackson, who in some dissents in that voting rights case that came out last couple months ago, maybe last week I think, referred to the 14th Amendment and referred to the Reconstruction Amendments. And as you know, the 13th, 14th, the 15th Amendments essentially rewrote the Constitution of this country. And we need to understand that history, and that history was back in the wake of the Civil War. The Congress wanted reparations, wanted to give some sort of reprise or some some assistance to African Americans who'd been in slavery.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for the question. The idea of the promissory note, as you referenced that, the messaging that comes into my mind is from another Dr. King speech as well, where he effectively stated, you know, we're not asking for you to do anything new, just to execute what you already wrote down on paper. You know, the words are out there, the ideas are out there, the commitments are out there, and I think what we find is so often we have many of the laws in place, we have many of the policies in place, we have many of the tools in our toolbox at our disposal, but there's a shortage of execution, or there's an unwillingness to execute. And as we bring in this consideration of a more sort of local or immediate conversation in an Oregon context, we see countless examples of that. You know, we look to the stipulation that with the hate and bias report hotline that the DOJ has, and how law enforcement agencies are required that when somebody calls and they're relaying an experience, when they're relaying a hardship or a trauma, that law enforcement, if they find that it has anything to do, or if the family raises the concern that we believe it's identity-based, you have to liaise them to that race and bias hotline. That's in there. They have to do it, but unfortunately the law that was passed didn't have a explanation, or didn't have a stipulation specifying what would take place if they didn't do it. And so now there's a lack of execution, and what we see is over 90%, or upwards of a large percent, far more than the majority of the percent of the cases the DOJ are receiving are not referred by law enforcement. And this is all people doing self-research, independent research, or being liaised by organizations such as the NAACP, right? So it's just but one example, and as we look at different, you know, school boards who are now adopting anti-harassment things and things of that nature, it's about execution. How are we going to execute it? How are we going to make sure that the policies that are put in place don't just sit up on a wall, don't just sit someplace in a handbook or a guidebook, but actually execute it? And you want to have a degree of agency. You want to have a degree of people within those roles being able to make determinations and look at the shades of gray that exist in society, but not at the expense of our people of color, not at the expense of our marginalized communities. And if folks' independent discretion doesn't inspire them into making the appropriate decisions as to when or not they're supposed to liaise, or when they are supposed to or not move forward with a specific anti-harassment or anti-racism policy that's on the books, then unfortunately it's a matter of training, and if there's a reluctance or there's an inadequacy following that training, then we have to continue to build an infrastructure that ensures that people execute what was committed on paper, not just at a very local, immediate level, but on the broader scheme. Just look into the Constitution. You know, it's only about 4 or 5 pages long. It's pretty quick, you know, and it summarizes a lot of ideas, and it summarizes perfectly what society could be if we just committed to it. So.
Sharon Reed, City Club member. I'm going to date myself a bit. I was 10 years old living in Baltimore, Maryland during the march. So my question to you is, or can someone comment on what were the repercussions then for Oregon, or being a very white state, how did the media, newspapers, television cover it on this side of the nation? Thank you.
Really, until the late 1940s, there were laws in place, maybe they weren't enforced, that African Americans in the city had to be in their tents, and there was a tent city out near Alton Baker Park where African Americans were expected to live. So it was not safe for African Americans to be here. And again, I would just reinforce what Miles was saying, because I'm a white male with significant privilege. If I am pulled over by the police will look at my license and say, oh, look, I have blue eyes, a white face, born in Topeka, Kansas. If Miles is pulled over, it's 5 times more likely he will be subjected to some form of police brutality. That brings it home. And so in the 60s, the March on Washington did affect the University of Oregon community. There were 3 University of Oregon students that went down to Freedom Summer. And Neil Goldschmidt, even though now he is disgraced, was an active force in promoting civil rights at the University of Oregon when he was ASUO student body president. He and his brother went down to Freedom Summer. And then when he was the mayor of Portland in 1969-70, he really was at the forefront of pressing for civil rights in the Portland area. And again, he's disgraced for good reason, but we also have to see that he did in his career do some good work. So the March on Washington did affect Oregon, and it did, you know, I grew up, I'm going to date myself too, about your age, and I remember Mark Hatfield and other progressive politicians back in that time period did make a difference with the bottle bill and with a number of other progressive environmental measures passed by Republicans. So at that time, there was, in part because of the civil rights movement and the environmental movement and the feminist movement, some progressive changes made in this state.
Yeah, no, I appreciate all that context, and a couple other quick, you know, items that I would relay as well is that Oregon has a really interesting relation to the civil rights movement as well as civil rights organizations. I wasn't aware of it until I assumed this role, but apparently the Portland branch of the NAACP is the first NAACP branch west of the Mississippi, the oldest one. It was founded back in like in the 1920s, Portland of all places, right? And so, yeah, certainly. And so that's a dimension of history. Even more interesting and even more proximal to Eugene, Wayne Morse was the national vice president of the NAACP. Wayne Morse was one of the kind of leading stalwarts at the time of civil rights in an NAACP capacity. And actually at the Mims House, we have a picture, a photograph of him presiding over, I believe it was an NAACP convention, a national convention meeting, where it was actually on the steps of the Lincoln Monument. And he was there speaking, addressing the crowds way back, I believe even before, you know, the March on Washington had taken place. So a little bit of local history here as well in a Portland capacity and also Eugene capacity too.
Hello. I'm kind of loud, so okay. So my name is Dr. Brenda Joy Sanders, and I'm going to kind of frame my question by telling you a little bit about myself. Of course, obviously, I'm a black woman who now lives in Oregon. I have a bachelor's degree in journalism, a master's in teaching, and a doctorate in education. And I'm framing that because my mother was a single mother of 8 children, and she worked very hard, 2, sometimes 3 jobs. And I think that sometimes I was listening to you talk, and I think that you talked about the promissory notice, and then you talked about the dream. And one of the things that I think that's so important to realize is that my world is not the world. You understand? Your world is not the world. It's just what you experienced, and based upon, like you talked about, if you got stopped as opposed to how if Miles was stopped. Okay, so our worlds are so different. And sometimes we forget that just because I have experienced something and this is the way that it is, that doesn't necessarily mean that's reality for everyone. Case in point, my mother always made sure when every one of her children, 8 children were born, she worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs. When we were born, she got an insurance policy that would start savings for us so that we would never have to beg for college. We would never have to worry about education because that was the most important thing for her. It wasn't something that was afforded to her. She was back in the days with the picking cotton days, and then because she was born crippled because her mother died giving birth to her, you know, she had to deal with a lot of things. College was not a possibility for her. And I'm going to say that I'm here today because of the dream part of that speech, the possibility part. The promissory notice is just as important, but also the dream is just as important because I couldn't have made it through, neither could my mother without that dream that Martin Luther King talked about. So it's just, I just had to say that it's just as important as that promissory notice because that's how black people sometimes make it through in those hard times when it doesn't seem very fair. It doesn't matter sometimes how much education or whatever, sometimes it's just the way that it is. So that dream, that dream piece is very, very important, okay? But the question I wanted to ask was, you talk about, there are a lot of initiatives I noticed as I come back to Oregon the second time, DEI and the diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I guess my question would be, how is it that we're going to go about changing a mindset? Because that's what we're dealing with. We pass all these initiatives, we do this, but then we go back to the same people in the same positions with the same level of power, and then that mindset hasn't changed. Now you just have a bunch of laws. And I talked to someone that here in Oregon that was in a position, and he said to me, it's so hard for me to be in a position, a person of color, to be in a position, and basically I make a lot of money. But the reality of that position is that I have no power that I should have. I'm there because I look and I have the color I have, I look the way I have, and they need to present this to the world. But my ability to make decisions, I've been told and made to understand. If you just shut up and if you just sit down, get out of the way, stay out of the way, you'll keep your job and your kids can go to college and you can acquire the things that you want to acquire in life, but you need to make sure that you don't mess with the powers that be, that you don't change anything for real. Now, we can talk about change all day long. We don't mind that. But that you don't change anything for real. So what I'm asking today, how do we change a mindset? That's my question. Sorry.
Dr. Sanders, thank you for that observation. And I go back to the observation I made about my privilege as a white man with blue eyes born in Topeka, Kansas. I recognize that. And it doesn't mean that I have to be defensive about it or try to pass laws that we shouldn't make white people feel guilty.
It won't solve anything.
It won't solve anything. I must answer your question by inviting us to go back to the civil rights movement of the 60s and the March on Washington as a model, because it has two different expressions. One is community building, and what Blue tried to do is to capture the relationships between whites and blacks that were designed to be in service to passing legislation. You're exactly right. Laws themselves will not change hearts and minds. Laws are very helpful.
Oh, yes, they are.
And when you pass laws, many people will obey them, even if they don't want to. But somehow we have to join the community building that really begins in kindergarten, because racism doesn't set in until children are about 6 or 7. And if 6 or 7-year-old children hear language from their peers, hear language from their cousins or uncles, they will use that language to frame the way they see the world. So early intervention that allows blacks and whites and people of different races and religious and ethnicities to come together in contact is key. We remain a grotesquely segregated society, and that can only be changed, in my judgment, 2 ways. One, by nonviolent social movements insisting that any laws or any policies or attitudes in particular, that feature or underscore racism or exclusion should be eliminated. That should be an assumption. I do, again, have hope. Evan, I hate to pick on you, but I think this generation, I'm 68, and my time is passing quickly, but people like Evan and Miles in leadership will be able to create educational systems that are designed to achieve the goals that we have. I have great admiration for your mother, because she struggled against significant odds, far greater odds than I can ever imagine as a white man with blue eyes. And so it's to credit to her that she did make use of the principles of the dream that King articulated, and she believed in them. And I think you do too. I do too, but I'm clear-eyed as you are, as well as you presented in your question, that it's not going to be an easy toil, because if you could see what is, as we all see what's happening in Alabama right now, with the state legislature refusing to acknowledge and implement a Supreme Court decision, refusing to acknowledge a Supreme Court decision that requires the elimination of gerrymandering. That's going on before our eyes. So when Martin Luther King Jr. on August 28, 1963, accused George Wallace of ignoring federal legislation, it's going on right now in Alabama. And King mentions Alabama. I don't know if that's a good response to your wonderful question. That's the best I can do.
Oh, no worries. Thank you.
So I guess my answer is two parts. One, as an example from my own family story. My dad's 83 years old. He was born in 1940. In 1968, and he grew up in Harlem, New York, and went to the military, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, for a little while before returning to Harlem for a few number of years. And in 1968, when Dr. King was assassinated, you saw the burning buildings from the riots that were taking place and things of that nature. I reference my father because I graduated from the University of Miami most recently in 2021. At the same age when I attended the university as my father, same age, he would have been legally unable to attend that university. And so I see a great degree of similarity there, just in that hope, in that dream, seeing my father, born in 1940, raised in Harlem, New York, not seeing opportunity prevalent, going to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and being stationed there, serving his country, and having to stick his head into a peephole to be served hours after his countrymen had already been served, to return, to drive taxis for 7 years while he went and got his degree from CCNY, while having 3 kids on top of that, before moving 5, 6, 7 different times, just to get out to the West Coast before meeting my mom, and ultimately, me and my brother came around. That was all on the back of hope and on the back of that dream, and he wasn't the marching type. He was the I'm trying to survive, just trying to get my family through the day type. He worked at IBM, so he was a civil rights fighter and champion in his own right. In the 60s, working in IBM, I'm sure he's one of the first black folk that were hired by IBM. He got his degree in computer science, but all the same, that dream was felt by so many people and felt in different ways, and so I just wanted to share that because our family is only possible here today because of that same dream. In a reference to your question on how do we change minds, I think it's reconfiguring our frameworks, and it's reconfiguring these words that we oftentimes throw out there and really take for granted. Equity, diversity, inclusion, all these umbrella terms that everybody thinks mean the same thing, but then when you get a room of 10 people and ask them what does diversity, equity, inclusion mean, you'll get 12 or 13 different answers, right? And so all that to say, how I see equity is, while equity manifests itself in outcomes, ultimately its goal is to change outcomes. In nature, it's not an outcome. It's an approach. It's a characteristic. It's a way of being. It's a way of, in each and every single moment that we can, each and every single moment that we can catch ourselves within, distancing ourselves from our immediate or initial assumption and instead questioning, what am I missing? What am I not seeing? Whose voice is not at the table? And it's through that process, and it's that difficult process. And I think one of the reasons why it takes so long to change these mindsets is we have a lot of conversations searching for that elusive shortcut, and it doesn't exist. Because we're reconfiguring and deconstructing 500, 600, 700 years worth of toxicity, worth of trauma, worth of damage, worth of misinformation in real time through a very short, finite period of lived experience that we each share individually as well as collectively, right? And so I think that's what we have to return ourselves to, is that equity isn't a program, equity isn't an office, equity isn't a division. Equity is a way of being, a way of interacting with yourself internally and individually, as well as the folks around you. And to that extent, as we talk about the road to equity, how do we facilitate equity, that's kind of a value statement, right? That's where we get to values, what are going to be our tenets, what are be our guiding principles. Rather than seeing values as what we wish to transpire, I want equality, I want equity, I want this, I want that. It's what are you willing to accept? If you say, I want a society that's equal, it's great. It's an outcome, it's a desired outcome. That's what we all ultimately, I would say an equitable society. We all want to be in an equitable society. But that in and of itself doesn't accomplish it. It's what are you willing to accept? What are you willing to embrace? What is that line in the sand that you draw that unwaveringly, regardless of situation, regardless of circumstance, regardless of who you're interacting with, that is going to be your North Star, your guiding light. That is where those flagpoles reside. And we don't see values enough as that. We see values as these lofty, starry-eyed ideals that we aspire to or that make us feel good. But they're not things that we're willing to put into practice. Or if we are willing to put them into practice, what is the consistency with which we're willing to place those things into practice? So, I see we have 3 minutes left, so just enough time for one more question if there is somebody.
So I couldn't get to Washington in '63, but I marched with Martin Luther King in '64, and in '69 in Chicago. In '69, we were doing demonstrations against the war, and one of the lessons we were taught by people who knew more than I did about big organizing big events was, remember to find your allies. That in this day, Lisa Arkin is an ally. Do not focus so narrowly on your single issue, but find the community of people whose core issues align with the value of your issues. And now I'm wondering, kind of in light of what you said, if that was good advice, or does that dilute the purpose of your, does focusing on more than one organization dilute your message? Because otherwise, I mean, you'd have to be in 16 different marches every week in this neighborhood. And they're not really unrelated in their core. But what do you think about forming allies across apparently different issues?
A. Philip Randolph was declared the most dangerous Negro in America in 1919, and Martin Luther King Jr. was declared the most dangerous Negro in America in 1963 because they believed in alliance politics. The power structures, the white power structure, wanted, and still does to a degree, African Americans and others to act out with violence. They want that. And so if violence takes place, it will be suppressed, and it will send a message to the white majority that violence is the preferred method of recourse. So that is why Randolph and King, in my judgment, had the right insight about how to make social change, and that is through nonviolent social movements that are interracial. So 240,000 people gathered on August the 28th, 1963, 40,000 whites, primarily from Protestant congregations and from labor unions, and then another 200,000 blacks for obvious reasons. And the military, on August 28, 1963, surrounded the Washington, D.C. area because they feared, as James Blue points out in his film, that there would be an outbreak of violence. And so the movement was disciplined. John Lewis insisted on nonviolence. Martin Luther King Jr. insisted on nonviolence. A. Philip Randolph insisted on nonviolence. Nonviolent action, not passive, but nonviolent action, sometimes coercive. And you remember in May of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. actually used children as a vehicle of protesting against racism. And there were those who said that was the wrong thing to do. I'm sorry, I think we have a couple more minutes left, right? Yeah.
All I'll say is just, the best advice I received when I was applying to college, because we talk about being well-rounded, right, is that when colleges are looking to bring in folks, they're not looking for a bunch of well-rounded folks who are good at a bunch of things but not great at anything. They want a bunch of people with points. People who have expertise or excellence in a given area. And if you get a group of people who across multiple disciplines who have a bunch of points, rather than having a well-rounded class due to everybody being well-rounded and a bunch of generalists, you have a well-rounded class because you have a bunch of exceptional people across the board in all these different sectors. I think social justice and civil rights is no different. And I think, truth be told, one of the issues that we have, one of the things that draws people into stagnancy as it relates to, do I get mobilized, do I get activated into the movement, is that you get overwhelmed. It's so imposing. We have health issues, we have legal redress. Trust me, at the branch we got 5 or 6 different standing committees, right? And they've all got different expertise areas. They all can have 5 or 6 different programs. We could hire an innumerable number of staff just to work towards that one specific issue, and it can get overwhelming. It can get very intimidating. But the advice I would give it to folks is find your point. And if there's multiple different points, if there's multiple different areas of expertise, great. If that's something that feels manageable to you, good on you, Godspeed. But if you're somebody who has one specific passion area, I can guarantee you there's disproportionality in that area of passion. There's disproportionality or inequity in that area of passion. There's work to be done in that area of focus. And each and every single one of us can become greater experts or can become more informed and fluent in what we do every day. If you're a mathematician, how can you make math more inclusive? How can you make math more representative? So on and so forth. And that's what we have to do, slowly but surely, because what you'll find is when you become an expert or you develop knowledge or awareness or fluency in one area, you'll realize it's the same in others. The terms change, the general focus area changes, but the systems don't. Different variables, but the same equation. And that enables you to slowly but surely gain more insight. And if you ultimately reach a leadership position, great. If you never reach a leadership position, fine. But just stay active, stay engaged, and choose one thing if you can't choose them all, and then grow from there. And closing comments. Well, thank you everybody once again for coming out here and enjoying this wonderful program. It was truly a joy to be here. Thank you to our wonderful speaker. It was a privilege to share the stage with you here today. And just thank you to all for sharing the room. It's truly amazing.